maintain that 60% of crown on the tree to produce the food for the tree. Otherwise, there's several, when we get to pole-sized trees, there's several main principles or rules of thumb to keep in mind. First of all, if we can't prune a tree up to 9 foot, then we shouldn't bother to do any pruning at all, because our objective in pruning is to make sure that we prune to get high-quality veneer logs. Now, the minimum size saw log or veneer log that a log buyer will buy is about 8 foot 6 inches. So if we use 9 foot as our minimum criteria, we'll be safe in creating a minimum size veneer log. So if you can't prune a tree up to at least 9 foot, which would be about a foot above my hand, then we shouldn't bother to prune the tree at all, because it's only going to be a saw log tree anyway. Some other kind of general rules of thumb when you're pruning trees is to not prune any branches over 2 inches in diameter. If you prune branches that are very large, over 2 inches in diameter, that makes a fairly large wound on the trunk of the tree, which takes considerable time to heal over. And as the tree matures, it might not have enough time to close that wound and add enough clear wood to be a veneer tree anyway. So try to restrict your pruning to branches less than 2 inches in diameter. Another key point to remember with pole-sized trees is to restrict all of your pruning to trees that are generally less than 8 inches in diameter. The reason for that is by pruning trees less than 8 inches in diameter, you're restricting those defects or those knots to the interior part of the tree, and then the wood that's laid on after that would be clear so that you get your veneer trees. If you prune trees larger than 8 inches in diameter, for example 10 or 12 inches, by the time those wounds close over and you start adding clear wood, your harvestable tree will have those defects in the wood anyway, and they really won't be veneer trees. So the thing to remember, prune the tree up to 9 foot, prune only branches less than 2 inches in diameter, and prune trees when they're less than 8 inches in diameter. In pruning pole-sized walnut trees, we use the same basic techniques as our other pruning on seedlings and saplings. It's just that we use some different size equipment. We'll use the lopping technique again, we'll use a selective pruning technique, and the side branch pruning. Now this is a young pole-sized tree that has good potential as a veneer tree. It's got a good 9-foot veneer log, but also there's a branch that's approaching about 2 inches in diameter, about 9 feet. Now 9 feet is the minimum size veneer log, but we also want to try to achieve or develop more of a veneer log than that and go even higher. So we might try to develop anything over 9 feet that we can get, whether it be 10 or 12 or 16 feet. Probably 17 foot is about the maximum we want to go to. But on this tree, if we can just work on this one branch at 9 foot, then the veneer log will be even longer than that. So what I'll do here is, rather than take the whole branch off, again we want to retain foliage on the tree, so I'll just lop the tip of the branch off so that it restricts that diameter growth. Then later on, as the tree grows in height, we'll come back and prune the branch off flush with the tree. But at that time we'll have a longer veneer log than 9 foot, possibly up to 14 or 15 feet. Again, we're going to use a lopping technique here on a branch that is kind of a problem branch on the tree. We don't want to remove too much foliage, but we want to restrict the diameter growth of that branch. So I'm just going to lop off the end of the branch. That'll restrict the diameter growth on that branch. We're going to do some minimal side branch pruning here by taking off one branch at about 8 foot. That will still maintain our 60% crown canopy. Now we're going to select a couple branches up in the tree that may cause a problem later when we decide to prune higher in the tree. We've got a branch here that's about 2 inches, approaching 2 inches in diameter. We've got another branch up above that's approaching 2 inches in diameter. If we leave some of the smaller branches on the stem and prune out these problem branches now, they won't be there to create a problem later when we prune up higher on the tree. So I'm going to remove this branch. And also one other branch. Now we still have smaller branches on the trunk of the tree to produce foliage and food for the tree. But yeah, we've removed the branches that could be problem branches later. When pruning and training young black walnut trees, remember to restrict your pruning to trees less than 8 inches in diameter. If you prune large trees, those pruning wounds that you make will not have time to close over, so that they will always be defects. Even though the log may be large, they will still be defects in that log. So remember to keep your pruning wounds restricted to that central core on small trees. Now if you get into larger trees, anything over 8 inches in diameter, but definitely anything over 12 inches in diameter, if you prune limbs off of trees, large trees like this, it may make the tree look like it's clean and not have very many limbs or defects, but the thing you have to visualize is that this tree is probably going to be harvested in another 16 or 20 years when it's around 20 inches in diameter. And right now it's about 14 inches in diameter. So if you prune off some of these limbs now, it's going to take several years before those wounds can close over, and by the time the tree gets to harvestable size, you're still going to have a defect in that log. So on large trees like this, it really does no good to prune off live branches. You might as well just leave those limbs on there so that they make solid knots in the lumber, rather than taking the chance of pruning them off and having decay and other problems set in that may be a hole in the lumber or another defect in the lumber. The only time that you would really do any pruning on large trees is where you get into sanitation type of pruning, where you might have an insect or disease infestation, or you might have a broken top from a storm or something like that that you need to prune out just to maintain the health of the tree. But to do any side branch pruning for quality control, it really doesn't pay to do any on large trees. Oftentimes on larger trees, or where pruning has been neglected, you'll have a dead branch on the tree that the landowner may want to prune off. And there's a couple things I'd like to point out here. Basically, the technique of pruning is the same, but I'd like to point out some of the cautions here. First of all, when pruning a dead limb, there's a collar area or a callus area that's forming around trying to close off that dead limb. When you prune a dead limb, you don't want to damage that collar or that callus tissue. So when you make a pruning cut on a dead limb, come out just a little ways and prune the limb off. Now, a lot of times people will try to prune flush with the trunk of the tree, and they'll actually damage that collar and get into live tissue so that you provide an avenue attack for decay. But if you prune outside of that collar, then the tree is going to be able to close over that wound much more rapidly and without the chance of decay. So we'll prune here, and watch where my saw cut is. Will be just outside of this collar without damaging any live tissue. Now you can see we've pruned the limb off. We've still got the callus tissue there with no damage on it, and just a very short time that wound will close over. Where if we'd have pruned flush with the trunk of the tree, we'd have made a large new wound that would take a lot longer to close over and also provide an avenue of attack for decay. Remember, the objective of pruning black walnut trees is to develop a straight, clear-stemmed tree. Pruning when trees are young will assure veneer quality trees that will command a premium price in the timber market.